If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers, maybe not even for sleep, maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push, they float. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe. Only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that don't remember how they got here. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. The ship doesn't creak anymore. It sighs. The sails have been taken down. The mast leans like a priest who stopped believing 2 ports ago. You're not a soldier tonight, not a senator. Just another shadow slouched beside cargo that smells like goat hair and salt. Ahead, the coastline of Egypt glows like something too old to be surprised, and yet you still think it might blink when you arrive. They say the sand knows first, before conquest, before maps, before ink dries or names are forced onto stones. Sand is the first to feel the footfall, the first to swallow it without leaving a trace. You disembark quietly, no triumph, no brass, no banners. Alexandria doesn't look conquered. It looks like it's already forgotten you're coming. And maybe that's the first thing that unsteadies you. Rome always arrives with its chest out, expecting either applause or resistance. But here, the wind doesn't even lift your cape. It folds around you like a shrug. The scent in the air is unfamiliar oil, sun-warmed papyrus, and something older that might be honey or rot. You can't tell. The harbor isn't quiet because it's empty. It's quiet because it doesn't need you. Roman Egypt begins with the sensation that nothing here was waiting. A donkey brays in the distance, half laugh, half mourning. You look back, half expecting a soldier to offer you certainty. But they're just as still, just as foreign, just as hushed. A boy walks past you, barefoot and covered in dust, carrying a scroll under one arm and a chicken under the other. He doesn't look at you. That scroll, you realize, may outlive you. That chicken might not make it to sunset. Both are real, but only one of them is essential to this place. Somewhere beyond the harbor, behind walls too thick for words and time too slow for clocks, the city waits. Alexandria, not Roman, not entirely Egyptian, just itself. You've stepped into a place that speaks in layers, and each layer is older than your ambition. The stones don't care who governs them. The winds don't rewrite their path because the eagle flag flies above the tower. What you feel beneath your boots is not conquered. It's patient. It's coiled. It's seen empires before and yawned politely. You wonder, is this what it means to arrive too late? Or perhaps too early for what's coming? Your orders were clear. Represent Rome. Enforce order. Be visible. But here, being visible feels like being watched. Not by people, but by the city itself. By the painted eyes of gods you don't recognize, carved above doorways like they're listening for trespass. You pass murals that shimmer even under dust, frescoes that should have crumbled centuries ago, and windows that hold shadows shaped like prayers. You don't know the stories behind them, but you sense they know yours already. Rome is strong. Rome is precise. Rome is the spine of the world. But Egypt is a pulse you can't time. At night, the city doesn't sleep. It whispers. A woman hums a lullaby in a language you've never heard, and you suddenly realize your mother's tongue never sounded that gentle. A market vendor rearranges dates on a tray, not to sell, but to make them look like a constellation you've forgotten the name of. You don't know why that matters, but it does. In your room, a borrowed room in a borrowed villa that once belonged to someone who smelled of myrrh and never raised their voice. You try to write a report, something formal, something Rome would understand. But your ink freezes halfway through the word stable. You stare at it, not because you made a mistake, but because the word suddenly feels like a guess. There's something unnerving about a place that doesn't resist you but also doesn't absorb you. Egypt, you sense, will not be tamed. It will be worn, like a garment that never fits the same way twice. The streets don't echo when you walk. They fold your footsteps into themselves. And the silence here isn't absence, it's choice. At the edge of Alexandria lies the necropolis, the city of the dead. You visit it, thinking it a formality. But it's more crowded than the Forum on a feast day. Tombs carved not just for bodies, but for memory, for preservation. Some tombs were built before Rome even spoke Latin. You trace your fingers along a wall and feel warmth where there should be cold. The dead here are not buried, they're curated. A child leaves an offering of honey at a statue's feet. You ask which god it is. She doesn't answer, or maybe she doesn't need to. You're not ready to know. The Roman world runs on marble. But here, everything feels made of breath and ash, temporary but determined. Somewhere, someone lights an oil lamp, not to see, just to remember what it felt like when someone used to wait for them. You walk back slower. The report you started. It's still on the table, unfinished. You realize it always will be, because what Rome wants, proof, structure, dominance, doesn't hold shape here. And somewhere deep inside, you feel it first, this won't be a province. It will be something else. Not claimed, not ruled, but shared, slowly, and without asking. You wake to light that doesn't behave like Roman light. It doesn't push into the room, or assert its presence like dawn over the Tiber. It simply arrives thin, golden, and slanted as if the sun here only rises for those who remember how to receive it. Alexandria doesn't announce morning, it allows it, and in that allowing, it tells you something that no general or priest dared to say aloud, that conquest might redraw maps, but it cannot reroute habits of the soul. Outside, the city has begun its day in a rhythm older than your empire. Vendors lift their shutters with a grace that feels more like choreography than labor. A woman sweeps the step of her home, not to remove dust, but to make a soft, circular pattern that leaves the ground more beautiful than clean. Pigeons roost along archways, too worn to remember which century built them, and the smell of simmering dates, toasted grain, and something vaguely medicinal lingers in the air like a forgotten blessing. No one salutes, no one bows, and yet no one resists. You feel neither welcome nor defiance, and that space between neither loyalty nor rebellion is harder to manage than you'd expected. Alexandria pretends, in the most elegant way, to obey. It displays your eagle standards in plazas that never needed them, but they hang beside faded images of other animals: the ibis, the crocodile, the lion-headed goddess, whose name you haven't yet learned. Statues of emperors are raised on marble pedestals, flanked by offerings that clearly weren't meant for them. Fruit wilts at the feet of Augustus. But a few feet away, a small boy lights incense to a figure with no Latin name, whose eyes look nothing like the emperor's and everything like the Nile. You're told by local administrators, Roman in badge, Egyptian in everything else, that the city is peaceful, that grain shipments are stable, that the temples pay their taxes, that no armed revolt brews in the alleys. All the right boxes are checked. But when you walk those alleys yourself, there's something too symmetrical about the cleanliness, too rehearsed in the smiles. The silence doesn't hum with tension, it purrs with irony. This isn't subversion, it's choreography. You begin to notice things you hadn't in your first days. In the marketplaces, Roman coins are accepted, but always examined a moment longer than necessary, as though being weighed not for value but for accent. Latin is spoken where required, but always with a melody at odds with the Republic's clipped cadence. Greek drifts through conversations like a river beneath the Latin surface, and Egyptian true, thick, unbroken slips behind closed doors like incense curling through a crack in a temple wall. It's not dead here, it's just waiting to speak where you aren't listening. Even the buildings themselves conspire to confuse. The bathhouses bear your architecture, your aqueducts, your symmetrical arches, but their mosaics tell stories you don't recognize, scenes of gods caught in half-human moods, creatures with wings and wounds that don't belong to any mythology you studied in youth. You ask a builder about one of the symbols embedded into a floor tile near the governor's office. He shrugs, says it was always there. You believe him. There are moments when you feel sure Alexandria is folding into Rome, when officials quote laws you recognize, when debates echo the Senate's protocols, when theater troupes perform comedies adapted from Plautus, but with darker, slower punchlines. You begin to think that perhaps this is what assimilation looks like, not erasure, but layering. And then, in the same breath, you see a funeral procession led not by priests in white robes, but by dancers in jackal masks, their bodies painted with river patterns, wailing in a register too ancient to analyze. You remember that death, here, was never an end but a migration. You don't fear the difference, not yet, but you start to feel it as an undertow. The guards stationed with you report fewer incidents than any other province under Roman control. There is no theft in the temple zones, no riots over grain, no open rebellion, and yet the men grow restless. They drink more, write fewer letters, and avoid eye contact when you ask what's wrong. One finally mutters it over a game of dice. This place doesn't push back, it just absorbs. You think about that for days. Back in your own villa, you try again to compose your report to Rome. This time, you write that Alexandria is compliant, though culturally complex. You pause at the phrase, it's polite, neutral, deceitful, but you let it stand. Not because it's true, but because it's the closest your language can come to expressing what Alexandria is doing to you. You realize you're using different ink now, locally made, thinner, with a faint smell of something earthy, lotus or myrrh. Maybe. It stains the page a soft brown, nothing like the bold blacks of Roman script. And yet, as your quill moves across the papyrus, the writing feels smoother, less like dictation and more like transcription, as if the story was already on the page and you were just brushing the dust away. That night, you attend a banquet held in the villa of an Egyptian merchant who insists, through a thick Greek accent, that he supports Roman rule wholeheartedly. The feast is elaborate honeyed duck, candied dates, perfumed wine, but the music played on lyres and pipes is distinctly local, and the dancers wear masks that depict creatures from Egyptian cosmology. Each movement a ritual you don't know how to decode. Every Roman toast is followed by an Egyptian blessing. Every declaration of loyalty is mirrored by a proverb older than your empire. The wine warms your throat. The floor spins gently. You find yourself lulled not by the music, but by the sensation of being outnumbered by something invisible. Not in bodies, but in meaning. Later, you ask the merchant if he believes Alexandria has truly become Roman. He smiles, not cruelly, but with the calm of someone who's seen empires before yours. Rome, he says gently, is a very good costume. But Egypt always wears its own skin underneath. That sentence follows you home. You begin to dream in images that feel borrowed. Papyrus boats on ink-colored rivers, eyes painted onto sarcophagi that don't blink but always see, animals with human voices. And in those dreams, Rome never appears, not even once. You wake disoriented. You wake changed. Historians will argue, centuries later, whether what happened next was integration or infiltration, whether Rome digested Egypt or Egypt rewrote Rome from within. The scrolls won't agree. The statues won't clarify. But somewhere in the footnotes, someone will point to this moment, the one where Rome was obeyed not out of fear, but out of performance. And beneath that performance, something else was listening. The performance was perfect, and that was the danger. She arrives long before her footsteps ever touch Roman soil, and by the time her ship glides into the harbor, its sail dipped in purple, its deck perfumed with spikenard and citrus. The men on the docks are already not breathing the same air they were moments before. Cleopatra doesn't walk into rooms. She replaces them, and you, watching from the governor's balcony, still clutching a scroll you've read 3 times, without understanding a word, feel the atmosphere fold toward her, as if the air itself has remembered something old and important. The histories you memorized didn't prepare you for her, not in any meaningful way. They described her politics, her alliances, her lineage, her wars. They spoke of the Ptolemies as if they were Greek in blood, Egyptian in title, Roman in ambition. But they never captured this ability to shift the gravity in a room with a tilt of her shoulder, the kind of presence that makes even silence feel orchestrated. And when she speaks, it's not persuasion, it's architecture. Words settle around her like stones in a temple, built with precision but meant to outlast you. You stand in a chamber lined with frescoes, faded by salt wind and incense, and you watch as she meets the Roman general not like a subject greeting a conqueror, but like a mirror offering back the image of a man who's never been seen this clearly before. Julius Caesar, seasoned, calculating. The very embodiment of republican authority doesn't shift backward or forward. He simply pauses. And in that pause, something irretrievable is lost. No declarations are made, no treaties signed. But by nightfall, the ship that brought her has been unloaded, her quarters prepared in the royal wing, and her proximity to power accepted without protest. Alexandria doesn't react. It's as if the city knew this would happen and has already rewritten its inner maps to accommodate her passage. You try to dismiss the moment as political performance, a theater of alliance and convenience. You tell yourself this is strategy, not sorcery. But when she walks past you in the corridor later that evening, her robe trailing a scent not of any flower you can name, but of sleep half remembered from childhood, you realize you're not convinced. Not entirely. She doesn't look at you. She doesn't need to. Her presence suggests that if you had something worth being seen for, she would have already noticed. You feel suddenly both invisible and uncomfortably transparent, as if your thoughts had worn through their own seams. The sensation lingers long after she's gone, like a perfume meant more to haunt than to please. There are dinners after that, formal gatherings where senators pretend to relax and philosophers sharpen each sentence as if it were a blade. But every conversation bends inevitably toward her orbit. She never dominates the table. Yet somehow every topic becomes one she had already quietly prepared for. When Cleopatra speaks of Rome, she does so with a delicacy that makes the generals smile and the scribes look up from their notes. When she speaks of Egypt, the room goes still. She refers to the Nile not as a river but as an inheritance. She doesn't say my people or my kingdom, but instead speaks as if her body itself is a continuation of the landscape. You begin to realize that she doesn't separate herself from Egypt. She embodies it, not as a queen in possession of a nation, but as the nation in the shape of a woman. The Roman governors try to remain neutral, but they begin using her turn of phrase. Soldiers guard her chambers with more attention than they do the treasury. And letters sent to Rome increasingly describe her not as a guest, but as a necessity. You find yourself repeating her metaphors in your own reports, as if her cadence had infected your syntax. The old gods are never mentioned, not directly, but you begin to see more offerings at the temples again, even from Roman citizens. A coin placed near the statue of Isis, a flower left beside a sphinx, half buried in sand. No one makes a proclamation, yet belief shifts its weight in quiet increments, like a building settling deeper into its foundation. Cleopatra's reign is not one of military campaigns or architectural marvels. It's a reign of presence, of timing, of always arriving 2 sentences before you thought to speak. She doesn't outmaneuver you, she edits you. And before long, even Caesar begins to change. Not in public posture, but in private language. He spends more time in the libraries, learns to pronounce Egyptian names without irony, and begins asking questions about the afterlife not as a philosopher, but as someone taking notes. What happens between them is a subject that scholars will never exhaust. Some will say it was love, others will insist it was strategy. But to witness it, to stand in the space where their gazes locked and the room folded inward like a scroll burned at both ends, was to understand that power doesn't always conquer. Sometimes it seduces. The two of them walk the palace gardens under moonlight, and you watch from the corridor shadows as she names the constellations not in Latin or Greek, but in a language that has no vowels and is carved more often than spoken. He doesn't correct her, he listens, and in his listening, something Roman begins to soften. It isn't treason, not yet, but it's no longer discipline, either. Whispers spread faster than decrees. A senator begins wearing his cloak in the Egyptian style, draped over one shoulder with a clasp of turquoise. A general references the Book of the Dead in a toast meant to honor the gods of Rome. A servant girl uses coal in the shape of a falcon's wing, and no one tells her to remove it. These aren't laws. These are symptoms. And you begin to wonder, was the seduction always hers? Or did Egypt itself choose her as its scent? In private, you find yourself rereading old texts from your academy days. You search for passages on influence, diplomacy, political manipulation. But none of them describe this feeling, this sensation that something beneath the surface of Alexandria has begun breathing through your skin. You dream of riverbanks that stretch forever, of scrolls written in flame, of voices that echo not forward, but backward through your chest. And in the center of those dreams is always her never speaking, never touching, but always watching, as if history itself has been waiting for you to become someone else. Historians still debate whether Cleopatra was Rome's greatest liability or its most dangerous mirror, whether she unmade Caesar or simply showed him what he already was. But standing here, now, as another dispatch leaves your hand written in ink sourced from her own scribes, you feel less like an observer and more like a page she's already underlined. And you begin to suspect that this story doesn't belong to Rome anymore. You begin to learn the layout of the palace not by the map engraved on bronze at the entrance, nor by the directions mumbled by bored attendants in soft, syncopated Greek, but by the way your body learns which corridors fall silent before you enter them, which doors hesitate before opening, and which rooms seem to carry a memory longer than any voice that's ever spoken inside them. This isn't a palace in the Roman sense of the word, not built to announce itself in arches and symmetry, not structured to reinforce order through repetition and logic, but rather something older, more organic, more unsettling. The halls twist not because they are poorly designed, but because they never intended to be explained. Walls don't divide space here, they redirect it, like reeds parting for the river instead of defying its flow. The rooms aren't places so much as moods made solid. And you start to notice sound doesn't behave here. In Roman villas, a voice carries, bounces, repeats itself. Echoes are a form of legacy proof that something was said, and therefore mattered. But in this palace, sound doesn't linger. It dissolves. You say a name aloud and realize you're the only one who heard it. You call for a servant and feel the word fade, as if the air absorbed your intention, but not your meaning. Some palaces assert themselves with marble and symmetry. This one hides behind breadth and curve. Even the floors don't align. Stone mosaics meet smoothed plaster in awkward transitions, tile bleeding into worn reed matting, as if the palace itself were a palimpsest, rewritten not once, but endlessly, until the walls forgot which version of themselves was the original. You pause at doorways and find that the threshold itself seems to choose your posture for you, whether you walk in upright or duck your head without understanding why. The servants here don't speak unless spoken to, but when they do, they glance past you not disrespectfully, but as though making sure someone else in the room approved your question before they answered. You begin to suspect there are hierarchies older than the Roman Empire, layers of custom and silence so deeply embedded that even rebellion would have to ask permission to speak. One morning, you stand in a chamber filled with scrolls, not yet catalogued, by the imperial library sheets of papyrus tinted with mold and time. Their edges curled like dry leaves after fire, and you realize none of them are labeled in any language you recognize. Some are mathematical, some liturgical, others purely poetic. One is written entirely in pictures, a hawk devouring the sun, a child walking backwards into the Nile, a throne crumbling under a weightless crown. You don't know what they mean, but you feel them anyway. Outside, a construction crew begins assembling what will become a Roman tribunal room, their hammers sharp against the morning stillness, their bricks cut to Roman dimensions, their mortar thick and efficient. But inside the palace, no such sharpness remains. Here, the architecture seems to absorb corners, to prefer the curve to the line, the alcove to the stage, the suggestion to the command. A historian visiting from Athens, shuffling in robes stained with ink and mango juice, tells you, over a long breakfast of honeyed bread and goat's cheese, that the palace predates the Ptolemies, that it was built atop something even older, perhaps a ceremonial site used during the Middle Kingdom, or even earlier, when pharaohs were not yet divine, but already learning how to live forever. You glance at the columns holding the roof above you. They lean slightly, not from age, but from memory. And you begin to wonder if a palace forgets how it was first built. Does it become more sacred or less? One night, unable to sleep, you drift barefoot through the hallways and find yourself standing before a statue you've passed dozens of times but never really seen. It depicts a woman regal, faceless, draped in cloth that was carved to move even in stone. Her hands are open, palms tilted forward, not in offering or reception, but in resignation. You stare at those hands for longer than you mean to. You try to count her fingers but can't. The marble has smoothed over centuries of wind, water, breath, and worship. She might have once held something, or someone. Now she holds only air. And yet, you feel strangely comforted. The next day, you ask a local priest about the statue, hoping for a name or even a half-remembered myth. He looks at you with a softness you weren't prepared for and says, "She's whoever you needed her to be." You want to ask if he means now, or then, or always. But the moment passes, and the palace keeps whispering. Roman architecture teaches you that walls are tools of containment. Egyptian architecture teaches you that walls are reminders of breath, of shadow, of what's no longer said aloud. The two styles exist side by side in this palace now, awkwardly cohabitating, like siblings forced to share a room after decades apart. Roman columns stand beside lotus motifs. Mosaic floors lead into alabaster staircases. You think they contradict, but perhaps they simply never agreed to the same story. Late in the season, a scorpion is found curled beneath the bust of a Roman magistrate in the East Wing. Some call it a bad omen. Others say it's only natural. But that night, the bust is moved quietly, without ceremony, and replaced by a small bronze figurine whose name no one tells you. Afterward, the air feels calmer. You begin to suspect that Rome is building more than walls here. It's building ghosts, and ghosts, unlike temples, do not ask to be visited. They arrive when you forget who you were trying to become. You write in your journal, "I no longer know whether this palace is changing, or whether I am simply starting to hear it." The next morning, your ink has dried into the shape of a feather. Not drawn, just formed. You leave it there. You don't want to understand. And for the first time in weeks, you sleep. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. The first time you stand on the banks of the Nile at dawn, something inside you goes quiet, not in awe, exactly, and certainly not in fear, but in a kind of softened confusion. The way your thoughts might slow when encountering something older than language, but still pulsing with intention. The river is not wide in the way Roman rivers are wide, not a declaration of power or distance, but it stretches with the quiet confidence of something that has never once needed to raise its voice. You try, instinctively, to measure it. Depth, current, direction. But those are Roman tools. And the Nile isn't interested. It doesn't offer you data. It offers you rhythm. There's no breeze. Yet the reeds bow gently at its edges, as though swept by a memory too ancient to disturb the air. A fisherman drags a net through the shallows with the weariness of someone who knows the river doesn't answer need only habit. A woman walks past carrying a basket on her head, and without slowing her step, she sings a tune that seems to belong not to her, but to the water itself. And you, standing in your imported sandals with the stiff hem of a Roman tunic brushing your ankles, feel overdressed not for the climate, but for the honesty of the scene. This isn't ceremony, this is continuity. You've heard the governors talk about Egypt as the breadbasket of the empire, its grain essential to Rome's survival, its harvests carefully monitored, taxed, and predicted. But standing here now, you understand how little control Rome actually has. The Nile doesn't flood because the Senate wills it. It doesn't deliver wheat because Caesar signed an edict. It rises when it wants, recedes when it's done, and its moods are tracked not by philosophers, but by scarabs carved into limestone walls, and by songs that farmers teach their children while planting in soil so rich it can hold not just roots, but secrets. You spend a day traveling upriver by boat, not the sleek, marble-adorned vessels of Roman pageantry, but a flat-bottomed craft stitched together with ropes that smell of mud and sun. Your guide, a man whose skin bears the leathered texture of someone who's never once spent a day inside, tells you the Nile's real name is not Nile. That was a foreign title. Its real name isn't spoken. It's sung, and only during the flood. You ask what the song means, and he smiles without answering. You take a scroll and begin making notes, but the ink smears, not from moisture, but because the boat doesn't jolt. It pulses, as if the water itself were breathing, and you realize you're trying to write on top of someone else's heartbeat. Villages along the banks lean toward the river in structures that seem half-grown and half-built. Mud brick walls painted with symbols you don't recognize. Palm frond roofs that shed light like feathers. Children play in the silt, their laughter casual, their feet nimble, their eyes older than you expect. No one waves at your boat, not from rudeness, but because your presence is neither disruptive nor interesting. Rome comes and goes, the river stays, and you begin to see the pattern. Tax collectors chart the crop yields with obsessive precision, but they do so with a kind of desperation, knowing that this year's grain might obey, but next year's might not. Priests still offer rituals to the inundation gods, not out of superstition, but because even after centuries of conquest, no one has invented a better strategy than prayer. And, in the great cities, officials whisper of reservoirs and irrigation plans, as though technology could replace tradition. But they still wait each year for the first brown ripple of floodwaters, like schoolboys hoping not to be forgotten. You learn that the Nile is measured not in miles, but in cubits. There are markers carved into temple walls, nilometers. They call them, and every cubit the river rises means something different. Abundance, hunger, plague, rebirth. One morning, you see a group of scribes painting a number on a public wall with a solemnity that feels more like prophecy than bookkeeping. When the number is high, bread will be cheap. When low, people will walk miles for a crust. But it's not Rome they blame or thank. It's the river. And the river doesn't care who's blamed. It just moves. Even the soldiers begin to notice. Their discipline, once tight and uniform, begins to slacken, not in revolt, but in drift. They grow quieter, drink more slowly, play games that no longer end in shouts, but in murmured stories about strange dreams and old gods they don't believe in but keep seeing in reflections. A centurion admits, after too much date wine, that he no longer gives orders with the same edge in his voice. He says it feels like shouting into a cathedral, only to hear nothing echo back. You start to wonder whether the river is watching, not with eyes, with time. There are stories about people who've tried to divert the Nile, dams, canals, tricks of engineering, all failed. Not with fury, but with indifference. The Nile doesn't destroy, it forgets. A wall crumbles, a channel dries, a plan unravels into silt. You ask a local engineer why the latest Roman dam was abandoned after just 6 months. He replies, "The river didn't like it." Then he laughs. But you're not sure he's joking. The local calendar doesn't follow the Julian months. It follows the river. New Year begins not in January, but when the water begins to rise. Birthdays are remembered by which flood carried them in. Marriages are scheduled according to when the banks can be crossed without losing guests. Deaths are buried with the soil still damp from what the Nile left behind. And in all of this, every ritual, every chant, every bowl of grain shared before sleep, Rome is tolerated, but never centered. The emperor is not unwelcome. He is simply irrelevant. Historians still debate whether this reliance on Egypt's grain was a strategic decision or a tragic vulnerability. Some argue Rome could have adapted grown more elsewhere, traded differently, but standing here, watching priests toss herbs into the water while a boy kneels to touch his forehead to the mud, you understand that it wasn't just a matter of supply, it was faith, not in gods, but in gravity. You write your next dispatch to the capital in slower handwriting, not because you're tired, because you've begun to speak like the people here with pauses that mean something. The Nile has made you wait, and now you find yourself listening not for voices, but for rising water. In a city where the gods once wore crowns made of lotus, and the stars were counted by priests whose fingers were stained with ink and oil. It would seem unlikely that Rome could introduce a deity and have it welcomed with anything but suspicion, perhaps even disdain. And yet, when Serapis entered the sacred vocabulary of Alexandria, it wasn't through conquest or decree. It was through something stranger, quieter, almost like seduction. He wasn't entirely new, that much you learn quickly. Serapis didn't arrive fully formed from the imagination of an emperor or the ambitions of a philosopher. He was a hybrid, a composite god, assembled from fragments of older divinities, like a mosaic made from the floor of a collapsed temple. The Greeks saw in him aspects of Hades, of Zeus, of Asclepius. The Egyptians heard echoes of Osiris, of Apis, of healing gods who lived in the earth and remembered the dead. He didn't replace anyone. He blended. That was his power. And Rome, so often rigid in its divine hierarchy, so invested in the precision of cults and ceremonies, somehow allowed this fluidity to stand. Serapis became not a theological debate, but a compromise, a bridge, a silence between syllables. You walk through his temple on a morning heavy with mist, the stones slick with the breath of water that hasn't yet decided to become rain, and you feel that same ambiguity humming in the air. Nothing here declares itself. It waits to be asked. Inside, the columns are tall enough to challenge your sense of verticality, but what captures your gaze is not their height, nor their engraving, but the way light filters through the thin veil of incense, refracting across the stone like memory itself had grown visible. Worshippers don't chant here. They murmur. You catch fragments of Greek, of Coptic, of Latin, softened by unfamiliar vowels. A child lights a lamp and walks backward from the altar, eyes closed. An old man places a coin beneath a statue's foot and touches the ground beside it, not in humility, but as if confirming something tactile, as if checking that the earth still remembers. Serapis, you learn, has no single face. In some depictions, he wears a basket on his head, a symbol of harvest, of cyclical abundance, but also of burden carried without complaint. In others, he sits like a philosopher, his beard curling with authority, his posture calm and unafraid of silence. And in still others, he dissolves into abstraction carved not as a man but as a flame, a ripple, a question. You find a mural once covered by plaster now partly revealed two figures, Roman and Egyptian, kneeling at opposite ends of a long table. Between them, not a god in form, but a bowl of water reflecting the ceiling above. Underneath, written in a hand you don't recognize, is a single phrase, "What reflects does not divide." The scholars have tried to explain Serapis as political invention, a clever syncretism designed to pacify both the Greek elite and the native Egyptian priesthood, to provide a common object of worship, a shared vocabulary for loyalty. But what those scholars never stood beneath was the hush of that temple at dusk. When the last lamps are being lit and the city begins to fold inward on itself like a papyrus closing against the wind. And Serapis doesn't feel like an invention. He feels like something remembered from before the need for names. And in that space, neither Roman nor Egyptian, neither old nor new, you begin to understand that religion here is not about dogma or empire. It's about fluency, the ability to speak across difference without erasing it. A Roman soldier leaves an offering beside a scribe from Thebes, and they do not look at one another. They don't need to. The silence between them is not awkward. It's sacred. You see it reflected in the markets, in the way a Greek merchant adjusts his pricing, not by coin, but by moon phase, or how a Roman physician hangs a protective amulet shaped like the eye of Horus above his doorway. No one comments on these things. They just happen, like tides. No one asks if the gods are real, only whether they've been greeted properly. Later, in your own quarters, you find yourself tracing Serapis's name into the dust on your window. You're not sure why. Perhaps because no other god here seems interested in holding both ends of a contradiction. Perhaps because he reminds you that power doesn't always assert itself with swords or structure. Sometimes it flows like ink, like water, like worship. And you wonder if this was how Rome began to lose not its control, but its center. Not by defeat, by diffusion. Historians still debate whether Serapis was a tool of imperial control or a sign of cultural surrender, whether the temples were built to unify or to distract. But here, now, inside the quiet echo of incense and the breath of a god with too many names to answer to just one, you suspect it doesn't matter. Because belief, once it finds the right silence to grow in, doesn't care who planted it. You stay longer than you meant to, not out of devotion, out of curiosity. You want to see who prays next. You want to see how they do it, and as you leave, the priest doesn't look up. He simply says, "He's not here." But he never leaves. Outside, the sun has softened, and you can't remember whether you entered the temple for understanding or for quiet. You first see the scroll by accident curled on a desk beside a bowl of dried figs, half covered by a cloth that smells faintly of clove. You don't mean to pick it up, not really. You're just tracing the edge of the cloth, noticing how even the linen here seems woven with a kind of restraint. When your fingers brush the parchment and the whole world seems to wait, it's lighter than expected, thinner, not fragile, but cautious, like something that had been alive too long to trust touch. It's papyrus, of course. You'd seen it before in Roman libraries, in imperial records, in decrees stamped with red wax and disdain. But this is different. This one has ink that doesn't just mark. It breathes. Characters that don't just mean, they ache. It isn't a scroll for reading, it's for remembering. The scribe who wrote it must have worked by lamplight, hunched over for hours, perhaps days, his thoughts bending themselves around lines not meant to be linear. The letters arc gently, like they were following the contours of a riverbank rather than the logic of a sentence. And somewhere between the second and third line, your mind stops reading in Latin or Greek or even Egyptian. You begin reading and pause. You ask who wrote it. The attendant shrugs. No one important, he says. But the paper was made in Memphis. It listens better. He says it so matter-of-factly that you don't even realize until much later how strange the sentence was. Not written in Memphis. Made, and not reads better. Listens. And so begins your understanding. Egypt wasn't just feeding Rome with grain. It was feeding her memory, her hunger to be more than marble and decree. In Alexandria, you begin to see that power doesn't only move through armies or taxes, but through symbols that survive long after anyone remembers why they mattered. In the temples, you find ledgers older than the Forum. They're not called ledgers here, of course. They're called breath stories. They record not just trade, but dreams. Not just transactions, but intentions. There's one that lists offerings to a now forgotten deity, a bracelet made of river reeds, a song sung only in heat waves, a silence kept for 9 days after a death that never made it into records. You ask a librarian why this was written down. He tells you, because it happened. Then he adds, and because someone might need it later. The Library of Alexandria still exists, fractured, relocated, reduced, but not gone. You expected columns and fire. What you find is dust and care. A woman with ink-stained fingers guides you between rooms filled with shelves made not of wood, but of tightly packed clay. Some scrolls rest in jars, sealed with wax that no one has dared melt. Others are laid bare, their fibers unfurling like dried flowers. When you reach for one, she stops you, not because it's sacred, because it's unfinished. Rome collects knowledge like it collects tribute to own. Egypt stores it like water to endure. The difference is quiet, but it seeps into every corner of this city. A senator visiting from Carthage once said in passing that Alexandria was the mind of the empire, and Rome was its muscle. He said it as a joke, over wine. But the laughter that followed had an edge to it, because there was truth there, and everyone knew it. Rome could conquer, but it could not remember without help. Even the currency begins to shift. Coins minted in Egypt carry not just Latin inscriptions, but symbols whose meanings aren't translated, just assumed. A lion facing east, a cluster of papyrus bound with twine, a crown shaped like an ear of grain. No one explains them. No one needs to, because these coins weren't meant to convince. They were meant to continue. And you begin to understand why the scholars here guard their scrolls so jealously, because they're not protecting history. They're protecting futures that haven't been spoken yet. The emperor once sent a request for a full copy of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, not to be read, just to be owned. The response was diplomatic, a summary, heavily edited, beautifully written, and entirely empty, because Alexandria knew what Rome did not. Knowledge cannot be transferred like wealth. It must be carried. Historians still debate whether the papyrus trade changed the direction of Roman literacy, or merely lubricated it, whether the scrolls that passed through Alexandria were tools of resistance or collaboration. But the facts are fewer than the questions, because most of the scrolls weren't meant for posterity. They were meant to be read once, understood by someone who needed them, and then either destroyed or hidden. And perhaps that's why Alexandria burns. Not once, but again and again. Fires set by accident, by siege, by fear, but never fully extinguishing what they tried to erase. Because you can burn a library, you can't burn a silence. There's a word scratched into a corner of one scroll, barely visible, like someone pressed it with a fingernail instead of a stylus. It isn't a name. It's a direction. downriver. You don't know what it means, but it stays with you, like a whisper you almost heard, like an address from someone who never left. One evening, you walk past a classroom where a teacher reads to a dozen children. The story is about a crocodile who forgot its name and wandered the desert looking for someone to remind it. The children laugh, but the teacher doesn't. You wait outside the window until the story ends. Then you write it down, not because you need it, but because something in you understands that someone might. The ink you use is Egyptian, the paper, of course, papyrus, the words, Roman, but the rhythm is neither. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. At first, you don't even notice them. The temples sit low in the landscape, quiet, often half buried in sand or swallowed by shadow, unlike Roman basilicas, which rise proudly in stone exclamation. These places sink softly into the earth as if they were never meant to be seen from afar, only remembered in close breath. They don't call out to you. They wait for your attention to slow. You follow a priest once he doesn't invite you, but he doesn't stop you either, as he walks at dawn through a field of partially collapsed columns. He carries nothing, says nothing. His robe is simple, unadorned. There is no ceremony here, no theatrical pause before a grand threshold, just footsteps in the dust, each one soft enough to be mistaken for a sigh. You pass no guards, no walls, just a gradual narrowing of light. Inside, the air changes, not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like time itself has pooled between these stones. The chamber is lit by a single shaft of sun that bends through a slit in the ceiling, landing on a stone altar shaped not like a throne, but a table, a place not for ruling, but for offering. The priest kneels, not in grand gesture, but in habit. You mimic him, not out of reverence, but because standing suddenly feels impolite. You wait, expecting something, a chant, a verse, a flame, but nothing comes, nothing except the sound of his breath, slow, measured, anchored, and then, barely above a whisper, he speaks, not to the gods, but to the stone. He tells it the date, the harvest prediction, the condition of the sick child in the southern village, the wind's shift over the past 3 days. He pauses between each item, as if waiting for a reply. None comes, yet he continues, and you begin to understand. This isn't worship as transaction. This is record, memory, a ritual that keeps history from evaporating. The gods aren't being praised. They're being reminded that the world still turns, that someone noticed. When he finishes, he stands slowly, dusts his knees, and walks away. You follow again, through a corridor carved with hieroglyphs so worn by fingers they resemble veins. At the exit, he finally turns to you and says, "We don't pray for miracles. We pray so the silence knows it's not alone." Outside, the city wakes. Merchants raise their stalls. Fishermen return with baskets of silver flicker. Roman officials emerge from shaded courtyards to begin the business of control ledgers, decrees, statues dusted before anyone important walks past. But in the temples, the rhythm remains unchanged, and increasingly, you find yourself drawn to it. You begin visiting them at odd hours, sunrise, late afternoon, once even during a sandstorm. Each time the structure feels different, not because of the weather, but because of your pace. These spaces are not designed for haste. They are not about arrival. They are about remaining. One evening, you witness a ritual in which no words are spoken. A woman places bowls of water in a semicircle around a statue with no face. Children scatter petals shaped like ears. A boy walks backward, sprinkling salt. At the center, a single flame is lit and then immediately extinguished. No explanation follows. No interpretation is offered. It happened, and then it didn't, and yet you feel it linger longer than any Roman triumph. Historians often struggle to classify these rituals. They call them superstitions, local variants, religious drift. They say such practices became increasingly marginalized under Roman rule, but that's the mistake, assuming these practices sought visibility at all. You suspect now that their power came not from being believed, but from being kept. You find evidence of this in strange places. In the margin of a Roman tax document, someone has drawn a crude symbol of Ma'at, the Egyptian personification of truth and balance, not as decoration, as punctuation, a quiet reminder that order is not imposed, but maintained. On a Roman aqueduct stone, you find a scarab carved so small it might have been an afterthought or a signature from someone who still remembered where the water had once come from. And you realize Rome occupies Egypt by day, but Egypt keeps the night. Even the funerary rites betray this. Roman elites buried in Egyptian soil adopt native symbols not out of faith, but fear that their legacy might dissolve if not wrapped in something older. A senator dies and is embalmed in linen, stitched with prayers he cannot read. A merchant requests a tomb shaped like an obelisk, but insists on being buried with a copy of Virgil. His wife adds a scarab for good measure. The inscription reads, "He crossed 2 rivers. May both forgive him." You walk once into a tomb newly opened for restoration. Inside, frescoes depict not battles or empires, but journeys, figures crossing thresholds, meeting jackal-headed guides, offering food to shadows. You ask the guide if the deceased was a priest. He says, "No, a tailor," then adds, "but one who sewed at night." That answer stays with you. A tailor who sewed at night, as if the act of creation, done quietly, mattered more than its product, as if the memory of work was holy. By now, you've stopped asking whether these rituals mean anything. Meaning seems too narrow a word. You begin to ask instead what they hold, what they preserve. Not just about the dead, but about what it means to keep speaking even after no one is listening. If someone offered you the choice now, Roman clarity or Egyptian mystery, you're not sure which hand you'd take. Clarity makes things easier, but mystery, you've learned, makes them last. You remember a line from an old Roman philosopher: "The body dies, the name fades, but the pattern remains." He meant it as metaphor. In Egypt, it feels literal. Some temples are kept open not by priests, but by habit. A child leaves a flower every day by a worn pillar because her grandmother once did. A man stops at a crumbling shrine before market, not to pray, but to adjust the stone slightly because it leans. No one teaches this. No one writes it down, and yet it continues. One scholar suggests these acts are a kind of resistance, that by maintaining the old ways, Egyptians refused Roman assimilation. Another says it's merely nostalgia, that cultures always cling to ritual when power shifts. But both miss something. This isn't resistance, and it isn't nostalgia. It's respiration. The temple breathes, even when no one enters, even when Rome forgets. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. You begin to notice it not in speeches, or scrolls, or proclamations, but in the quiet discrepancies, the gaps between what is declared and what is done. A tax law issued from Rome arrives in Alexandria 2 weeks late, only to be adjusted by a governor's scribbled amendment at the bottom. A new grain standard, announced in Latin, is met with polite nods, but fields continue to be measured by the moon, and not the measuring stick. A revised census form bears categories that no local recognizes, and so they fill them out in their own ways, half truth, half tradition, and wholly theirs. It happens slowly, not like rebellion, more like erosion. At first, Rome tries to tighten its grip. It sends more administrators, demands stricter record-keeping, insists that Latin be spoken in all official capacities. But the land responds not with defiance, but with a sort of practiced stillness. The edicts are read, they are even copied. But by the time they are implemented, they are changed, softened, bent, not broken, just tilted slightly. Like a reed swaying under weight, it pretends not to feel. In the courts, Roman judges quote the law, but rely on local elders to explain what truly happened. Contracts are signed in triplicate Latin for the officials, Greek for the merchants, and Demotic for the gods. In one case, a verdict is delivered in Latin, translated into Greek, and then corrected by a midwife's memory of a village burial custom that had no place in any statute, but somehow settled everything. And still, Rome calls this province stable. The reforms continue. Year after year, a new plan arrives streamlining this, abolishing that, standardizing what could never be standard. You hold one of the official documents in your hand once. The parchment is flawless, the handwriting meticulous, the words definitive. And yet, even as you read, you know none of it will land the way it intends. The ink may be Roman, but the margins belong to someone else. It isn't sabotage, it's survival. Egypt, you begin to understand, has a memory older than the empire trying to contain it. You cannot erase that with forms. You cannot overwrite it with Latin. You see it in the calendars. Rome insists on its Julian order, assigning months and days with imperial precision. But in Alexandria, time still bends to the rhythm of the Nile. The new year begins, not on January's first chill, but with the flooding the river's generous spilling over its banks, an act older than cities. Festivals remain aligned to stars that Rome doesn't track. Days are measured in shadows, not hours. An official once asked a farmer to record his work according to Roman weeks. The farmer replied, "But my wheat doesn't know Saturn's name." Historians still debate whether these soft resistances were deliberate or simply cultural inertia. Some argue that Egypt absorbed Roman rule like stone absorbs heat imperceptibly, over time, and never on Rome's terms. Others suggest it was passive protest, a way of saying we're here without saying anything at all. But perhaps it's something else, something quieter. Perhaps it was simply the land refusing to move faster than its breath. There's a kind of storm that only Egypt knows, born not from wind, but from the way time rubs against stone. A sandstorm not of violence, but of memory, where the past isn't swept away, but stirred gently, until it hangs in the air like a curtain you forgot was there. You walk through one such storm near dusk. The sky turns gold, then gray, then the color of old parchment. Your eyes sting, not from pain, but from the sensation of forgetting. You pass buildings that should not still stand, and yet they do, not because they were preserved, because they were simply left alone, because no one dared rewrite a line that the Nile itself had drawn. At the heart of the city, there's a building half drowned in sand. It once held grain, then scrolls, then soldiers. Now it holds silence. A plaque outside names it incorrectly, calls it a barracks. You know better. It was once a school for dream interpreters. The roof collapsed years ago, but locals still leave tokens by its door: a feather, a lock of hair, sometimes a piece of broken mirror. When you ask why, an old woman shrugs. "Because it remembers what we meant," she says. Even Roman soldiers begin to adopt these rhythms. They count time differently after 2 years in Egypt. They refer to the heat not in degrees, but in moods. One centurion marks his leave not by date, but by the first bloom of desert lilies. His official report confuses his superior, who annotates in red ink specify day, month. But the centurion doesn't. He never does. You find his journal later. A simple thing, leather-bound. Most of it is unremarkable entries about duty, discipline, coin counts. But in one margin, he's written something that stays with you. "We were told to bring order, but the order here is older than our orders." That becomes your refrain. You begin to watch the reforms fail, not dramatically, not like broken laws or disobedient mobs, just quieter offices, dustier records, officials who come and go with less conviction, policies that arrive with flourish, and dissolve without sound. Rome continues to speak loudly, but no one answers with the same urgency. And yet, life here thrives. The city doesn't collapse. It adapts, like water finding new channels, like language evolving while pretending it hasn't. You see graffiti in alleyways, mixing Latin verbs with Egyptian syntax. A prayer written half in hieroglyphs, half in Roman cursive. A child sings a lullaby that rhymes in two languages but makes sense in neither. No one seems concerned, and that's the part that unnerves you most. Not the change, but the ease of it. One day, a census officer complains to a clerk that no one will give a straight answer about land ownership. The clerk replies, "That's because land here belongs to stories, not names." You watch that phrase ripple across the room. The officer laughs, then writes it down. And perhaps this is what the empire missed. That conquest isn't the end of change, it's the beginning. That when you hold something too tightly, it finds new ways to slip through. Egypt was never truly conquered. It was translated, slowly, strangely, beautifully, not into Latin, but into something Rome could no longer control. And when you ask yourself if this is loss or transformation, you don't know how to answer. You only know that the air here is thicker now, not with smoke, but with meaning that refuses to simplify. Even if this part vanishes, it wouldn't be the first thing to do so quietly. It begins, as many things in Rome do, with a portrait. Not a painting, a coin. Augustus's face, stamped cleanly into silver, eyes serene, chin lifted, ringed by laurels, and beneath it, the title, Emperor of Rome and Pharaoh of Egypt. The contrast is striking. In Rome, his profile is power. In Egypt, it is something else. A declaration, a negotiation, a surrender to necessity. Because conquering Egypt was one thing, but keeping it, holding it without letting it swallow you, proved far more difficult. Augustus knew this, or at least he learned quickly, when he claimed Egypt in the wake of Cleopatra's death. He didn't raise her temples or erase her gods. He didn't strip Alexandria of its dignity. Instead, he stepped into the role she left behind not as her lover, not even as her rival, but as something far stranger, her heir. In order to rule Egypt, he had to allow parts of Egypt to rule him. And so the compromises begin. Not public, not formal, but layered deep in gesture and costume, in architecture and ceremony, in the symbols woven into the borders of imperial robes. The new emperor is worshipped in Thebes as a living god, not by his own demand, but by the cultural momentum that would have demanded it of any pharaoh. To refuse the rites would be to fracture the fragile peace between Rome's authority and Egypt's identity. So he participates, not eagerly, but fully. He accepts offerings. He appears in festivals alongside deities whose names he cannot pronounce. He allows his image to be carved next to Horus. And while his marble busts in Rome remain severe and clean, his Egyptian depictions wear the curved beard of the divine. He doesn't change, but he is changed. Historians call it syncretism, a blending of traditions. But that word feels too technical, too clean. What happens here is less like fusion and more like camouflage. Augustus masks himself not to deceive, but to be accepted because Egypt doesn't respond to conquest alone. It responds to recognition. Even the architecture tells the story. The new temples erected in Augustus's reign do not look Roman. They do not follow the strict symmetry of Vitruvian ideals or the disciplined geometry of the Forum. Instead, they echo the layered corridors and narrow sanctuaries of ancient Egyptian design. The builders are local. The artisans, too. Augustus does not impose his vision. He adapts. Or more precisely, he allows Egypt's vision to absorb his. Not because he loves it, but because he understands something his successors will forget, that power in Egypt comes not from control, but from cooperation with its rhythms. You walk through one of these temples, rebuilt under Roman command, but whispering in a native tongue. The hieroglyphs tell stories not of conquest, but of continuity. They speak of a ruler who comes from far away, but brings the flood with him. They carve his name into stone beside the symbols of plenty, rain, and calm. But you notice something strange. The Roman eagle is always smaller than the Nile lotus. It's a detail you might miss, but once you see it, you begin to see it everywhere. In murals, the emperor stands behind native gods, not above them. In ceremonies, his name is spoken second, not first. In rituals, his presence is permitted, but not central. He is there, but he is learning. And perhaps this is the most difficult thing for Rome to accept, that to truly hold Egypt, one must kneel to it, at least a little. The Senate back in Rome is uneasy about this. Some senators whisper that Egypt is infecting Augustus with superstition, with softness. They mock the idea of a Roman bowing in a temple built for jackal-headed gods, but they do not dare challenge him, because Egypt feeds Rome. Its grain keeps the capital from riot. Its trade routes feed the coffers. Its silence, its long, unresisting quiet, makes the empire feel eternal. Still, not all accept this compromise so quietly. A group of Roman philosophers, appalled at what they call Oriental indulgence, publish treatises on discipline, on Roman virtue, on the dangers of becoming too enchanted with the East. They speak of marble and iron, not linen and incense. They remind Rome that its strength lies in its backbone, not in its breath. But breath is what Egypt controls, and Rome, for all its discipline, needs to breathe. So the duality continues. In Rome, Augustus remains the principled statesman, the first among equals, the rebuilder of the republic's illusion. But in Egypt, he becomes something else entirely, a mask worn over a dream, worn over a crown. Coins continue to circulate, bearing Latin inscriptions on one side and symbols of Egyptian divinity on the other. You hold one in your hand once, feel its strange weight, and realize it doesn't balance evenly. The Roman side gleams more brightly, but the Egyptian side feels older, and, in a way, more permanent. Was it deliberate? Did Augustus intend to become both ruler and subject at once? Or was he simply caught in the slow gravity of a civilization that had mastered the art of swallowing conquerors whole? Scholars still debate whether his policies in Egypt were strategic brilliance or quiet capitulation. Some argue he was playing the long game, blending cultures to stabilize the frontier. Others suggest that Egypt played him, that it offered obedience on the surface while rewriting him beneath. You don't know, but you begin to suspect that the truth lies not in whether Augustus conquered Egypt, but in whether Egypt ever stopped shaping him. You visit a tomb dated to his reign, commissioned for a local nobleman but funded by Roman officials. The artwork is hybrid. Roman figures in togas stand beside Egyptian gods holding ankhs. The sarcophagus bears an inscription in Latin that praises the emperor, but beneath it, almost invisible, is a second line carved in Demotic. You ask what it says? The guide hesitates, then answers. It says he was kind to the river, not to the people, not to the gods, to the river. It's the highest compliment Egypt offers, because in Egypt, the river decides everything. And maybe that's the truth Augustus learned, that here, the land itself is sovereign, not the buildings, not the soldiers, not even the emperor. If you treat the Nile with respect, it returns favor. If you don't, it remembers. The crown of Egypt, worn in ceremony by Roman rulers, is not made of gold alone. It is laced with obligation. It hums with history. And once you wear it, even briefly, you carry it long after the ceremony ends. Rome will continue to grow. Its legions will march further. Its borders will shift and bend and bleed. But its dreams, the ones that matter, begin to twist in this moment, in this land, beneath this sky. You wonder, not for the first time, if this was the beginning of forgetting, or the start of remembering something older than the empire itself. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. You arrive in the quiet years, the years after the storm of conquest has passed, but before anyone dares admit the shape of what remains. The Roman world still stretches its limbs across continents, still pretends to exhale power with every grain shipment and census form. But here, in Egypt, the empire no longer marches. It lingers. And what lingers learns to change. Egypt becomes a province officially, administratively, even linguistically. It is absorbed into the fabric of Rome like a patch stitched too tightly, too visibly. It is now governed not by kings or priest pharaohs, but by prefects sent from the capital, men who wear togas with the stiffness of new cloth and carry scrolls heavier than they know how to read. Yet for all the titles printed in wax and carried by messengers, Egypt does not bend in the ways Rome expects. It does not collapse into its new shape. It refuses, but not by force, by endurance. You notice it first in the way decisions ripple through the city, not like commands, but like rumors. Rome declares, Egypt nods. But underneath the nod, a shrug waits. And underneath the shrug, something much older stretches its arms, a system that has outlived dozens of rulers, one that understands patience better than policy. In the alleys of Alexandria, temple scribes still copy horoscopes for a fee. Women still whisper prayers to deities no longer listed in the imperial registry. And children still play beneath statues whose names Rome has stopped carving. They do not call it resistance. They call it routine. And so Egypt becomes not a subject, but a shadow. It aligns itself just enough to remain in Rome's light, but not so closely that it forgets its own outline. The prefects write glowing reports to the Senate. They note tax compliance, grain yield, public order. On paper, Egypt is the ideal province, profitable, peaceful, picturesque. But you begin to suspect those documents lie not out of malice, but misunderstanding. What appears calm is not always loyal. What seems compliant may only be uninterested in attention. You sit in on a tribunal, once a Roman judge, fresh from Athens, presiding over a local dispute about land boundaries. The arguments are made in Greek. The evidence is drawn from contracts etched in demotic on weathered stone. The judge listens, nods, then turns to his assistant and asks for clarification on the flood pattern that year. The assistant shrugs. The litigants shrug. And the case is settled not by law, but by the memory of an old fisherman who recalls where the water reached on the day his roof caved in. That, you realize, is how decisions survive here, not through logic, but through story. And what is more Roman than story? Perhaps that's the irony. Rome, the master of myths, finds itself in a place where the myths are older, deeper, more tired of being explained. Coins still flow from the Alexandrian mint, silver, and gold, stamped with the emperor's face, but their edges carry whispers. They pass through the hands of merchants who speak in metaphors, of weavers who sell fabric dyed in forgotten formulas, of midwives who carry herbs pressed into clay tablets with rituals older than the gods they now pretend to believe in. Some nights, the temples remain lit long after the prefect's palace has gone dark. In one, you hear a chant that doesn't translate cleanly, a refrain that echoes up into the night air and fades into something like breathing, a rhythm not meant to be heard, only felt. Rome owns Egypt on parchment. Egypt owns Rome in time. And still, the empire dreams of permanence. Historians still debate whether this quiet autonomy was permitted by Rome or simply tolerated by accident. Some claim it was a strategic oversight, Egypt too far, too strange, too rooted to be reshaped efficiently. Others argue it was deliberate, a calculated exchange of true power for consistent tribute. But you begin to sense something deeper, something unmeasured, that Egypt, simply by continuing, reshaped the empire from within. You see it in the small things, Latin being taught with Egyptian accent marks, Roman military formations adjusted to account for desert heat, festivals that fuse imperial holidays with river rituals so seamlessly that no one remembers which came first. Even the tombs speak in echoes Latin epithets beside scarabs, marble faces flanked by jackals. And the people, they drift, not toward rebellion, but toward something more dangerous to empire indifference. They do not chant against Rome. They simply stop mentioning it unless required. They do not fight the emperor. They forget to name him. You remember one afternoon a group of boys skipping stones on the Nile? One carves a face into his stone before he throws it. You ask him who it is. He shrugs. The man who built the wall, he says. Or maybe a god. Then he laughs. It's always the same after a while. Later that night, you walk through a courtyard where the statues have lost their noses, not from conquest, not from time, but from fingers worn thin by centuries of reverent touch. You touch one yourself. Cold stone, warm silence. You don't ask who it depicts, because the name wouldn't matter. And still, the empire collects taxes. Still, ships leave Alexandria heavy with grain. Still, the Senate reads its scrolls and nods at charts and pretends the province is asleep. But it isn't. It's dreaming. Of a time before Rome. Of a river that never signed a treaty. Of gods who didn't need to speak Latin to be obeyed. And perhaps that is what frightens the empire most, not resistance. Not uprising, but the quiet knowledge that it has not replaced the thing it conquered. That beneath the Roman roads and marble facades, something older breathes, something that does not need permission to survive. Because Egypt, when wounded, does not cry out, it waits. And when it waits long enough, it teaches. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. The first time you hold one, you expect metal cold, indifferent, weighted with nothing more than the logic of exchange. But instead, the coin carries warmth, not from touch, but from memory. It smells faintly of damp clay, of old ledgers bound with twine, of lotus petals pressed into wax to seal letters that no longer need addresses because everyone in the city already knows where they'll go. Coins minted in Alexandria during Roman rule do not sound like Roman coins when they strike wood. There's something in their alloy, maybe the proportions of copper, maybe the air itself when it cooled on the minting press, maybe just the quiet grief of a city that was once the center of the world and now pretends to be content as a tributary. They land softer, somehow, as if even currency here remembers it used to be sacred. One side bears the image you expect: Tiberius, or Claudius, or Hadrian, depending on the season. Stoic features, imperial titles, laurels pressed against a skull that won't be remembered in detail. But flip it, and the symbols twist. There are eagles, yes, and laurel wreaths, but they sit beside crocodiles and papyrus bundles, ankhs and cobras rising in postures of coiled readiness. Latin letters wrap around shapes that predate the alphabet itself. It's not a contradiction. It's a compromise. You imagine a market scene. A Roman officer pays a Theban merchant for dyed linen. The coin clinks against the table. The officer hears authority. The merchant hears continuity. For one, it's the voice of the empire. For the other, it's the breath of the Nile, now passed from hand to hand. The prefect in Alexandria does not authorize these hybrid designs out of kindness. He does it because he must. Egypt is not just a supplier of grain and papyrus, it's a cultural centrifuge. Any economy here that does not bend to symbolism quickly breaks under silence. So the coin becomes not merely a token of value, but a treaty in miniature. One side flatters Rome's pride. The other reminds it who really wrote the first ledger. And it worked. The currency spread across the eastern provinces faster than any imperial edict could travel. Merchants from Syria to Cyrene carried these coins like charms, whispering to one another in alleyways that the Alexandrians made lucky money. as if superstition were smelted into the copper. In a way, it was. The mint at Alexandria became one of the busiest in the Roman world, not because it produced the most coins, but because it produced the most trusted ones. There was something in the consistency, the clarity of the markings, the symbols that, even when foreign, felt strangely familiar. You could feel the water in them, not just figuratively. The Nile had a way of touching every hand that handled silver. It was the empire's bloodstream, but this was its pulse. A papyrus fragment found near Memphis speaks of a local priest who buried a handful of these coins in his garden, not for safekeeping, but for fertility. He believed the face of the emperor, pressed against Egyptian soil, would encourage the roots to find ambition. You smile at the image, a coin as prayer, a transaction as blessing, Rome's economy, digested into myth. And yet, none of it was fiction. The grain taxes collected from these provinces funded the forums of Rome, the games, the grand amphitheaters. Senators walked beneath colonnades built from Egyptian tribute. They held those same coins without knowing they still smelled like incense, that they passed through the fingers of scribes who wrote their gods' names backward so the evil spirits couldn't find them. The economy flowed, but what flowed with it was faith, memory, suspicion, and longing. Historians still debate whether these Alexandrian coins represented assimilation or clever subversion. One theory posits that they were designed to help locals transition into Roman economic structures without cultural friction. Another suggests they were Egypt's quiet way of writing itself back into the empire, not as a subject, but as a collaborator with its own language, its own rituals, etched into metal that no one could ignore. In one of the ledgers kept at the Serapeum, there's an account of a Roman overseer who tried to switch to a more standardized currency. The temple workers refused. They insisted that only coins bearing the image of their own city's mint could be used to purchase offerings. The reasoning wasn't economic. It was emotional. The other coins, they said, didn't know their prayers. You walk along a dock in the harbor of Koptos, watching crates of goods being loaded by hands that move with the familiarity of generations. In one crate, glass bottles filled with Nile water, blessed and sealed with wax bearing the imprint of a half-Roman, half-Egyptian seal. In another, handfuls of Alexandrian drachmas, wrapped in silk, destined for temples in Asia Minor, where no one would read the inscriptions, but where they would still be placed beneath statues and left for the gods to sort out. Money moves, belief lingers. And it wasn't just commerce. The coins became emblems. Lovers carried them between letters, tucking them into folds of clothing as if the weight could stand in for touch. Soldiers posted far from home carved little altars using them. One side turned to Rome, the other to whatever still dreamed in their own bones. Children played games with them, calling the Roman side sun and the Egyptian side shadow, never asking which one won more often. And always, the coins came back to Alexandria, back to the banks of the Nile, as if drawn by some metallic tide that Rome never learned to read. If currency is the language of empire, Egypt never quite spoke it fluently, but it sang it. And in that melody, something shifted. You see it in the reactions of Roman administrators over time. Early on, they complain of superstition, of inconsistent market weights, of strange local fees paid not in coin, but in grain or ritual offerings. But later, much later, you read reports filled with respect, even reverence. One official writes that trade in Egypt is conducted with a seriousness bordering on prayer. Another calls the coins anchors of civility in a world growing more restless. What they don't say, but what you can feel between the lines, is that Egypt taught Rome to listen, not loudly, not obviously, but steadily, with weight. And perhaps that is what this entire empire would become, not a story of conquest, but of exchange. Not the imposition of one truth, but the slow accumulation of many. each one flattened, pressed into metal, passed from hand to hand like a whisper that becomes, eventually, a song. A coin drops from your hand into the river. It disappears beneath the surface. No splash, just a circle of ripples widening outward, slowly, evenly, like breath. The Nile does not flinch. It has held more. It has swallowed better. And it remembers. So does the metal, even now, centuries later, when archaeologists dust them from dry soil and polish them back to clarity. The coins carry something that cannot be measured in mint year or metal content. They carry rhythm. They carry silence. They carry the moment Rome stopped speaking and began, for once, to hum along. You wouldn't notice them at first, not in the way you'd expect Roman soldiers to stand, not with the stiffness of marble statues, nor with the clangor of iron promises. In Egypt, they walk a little slower, as though the sand has taught their feet a softer rhythm. They wrap linen around their helmets, not because they were ordered to, but because someone's grandmother told them it would keep the sun from stealing their sight. They greet the locals in Greek first, Egyptian second, and Latin only when someone reminds them which empire they serve. They are still Rome's men, of course, at least in theory. They report to Roman governors, read Roman orders, accept Roman pay, but they eat what the market sells, not what the ration lists suggest. They tattoo symbols on their arms that no officer recognizes. One of them places scarab amulets beside his sword at night, just in case the old gods still listen more closely than the new ones. And none of them write home about what they've begun to dream. Because something happens when a soldier is stationed too long in a place that doesn't try to impress him. Egypt does not flatter the empire. It watches. And in that watchfulness, the soldier becomes something in between, not Roman, not Egyptian, but a quiet fusion of both, a being shaped by heat and dust, and the strange calm of knowing no one truly waits for you to return. You find a ledger buried beneath a collapsed granary. In it, a centurion keeps track not only of troop movements and expenditures, but of marriages, dozens of them. Roman soldiers marrying local women, often without formal approval. Some don't even bother asking. They build families in adobe houses with reed roofs, learn how to bless a newborn, using words their fathers would have called blasphemy, and forget the smell of the 7 hills. It was never just romance, it was gravity. The Nile does not let you stay untouched. It seeps into food, into breath, into dreams. And the soldiers, once sent here to impose discipline, end up being the ones most disciplined by silence, the kind that waits behind doors and speaks through children who answer in languages their fathers still stumble over. You imagine one of them, perhaps named Marcus, perhaps not watching his son chase goats through a courtyard scented with coriander and ash. The boy doesn't wear a tunic. He wears a loose robe stitched by his mother, dyed with indigo and marked with symbols Marcus doesn't understand, but now associates with safety. The boy laughs, and Marcus laughs too, though he doesn't know why. Later that night, he'll touch the scar he received fighting Parthians and wonder why it feels older than the country he calls home. And so begins the slow fading, not erasure but blending. His Latin becomes quieter. His gestures shift. He starts offering wine with his left hand, as the locals do, out of respect for what is unseen. He forgets the birthdays of emperors, but remembers when the moon should not be watched. He learns the names of stars used not for navigation, but for prayer. And he begins, slowly, to ask fewer questions of the world, not because he's lost curiosity, but because Egypt has taught him that not every mystery needs a knife. Historians still argue about the depth of this cultural bleeding. Some claim the soldiers remained fiercely Roman in their allegiance, that these changes were superficial, like dust on armor, easily wiped away when duty called. Others say the transformation ran deeper, that stationed long enough. The legions became seeds in foreign soil, sprouting into trees whose fruit no longer resembled their roots. Archaeologists have found shrines in army camps dedicated to Isis, to Anubis, to local river spirits. They've uncovered letters written home in Latin, but mentioning dreams interpreted by Egyptian priests and illnesses cured by herbalists who never read Galen. One officer even requested permission to be buried with an ibis feather under his tongue, not for show, not for irony, but because he believed it would help him speak in the next world, whether to a Roman god or an Egyptian one. He didn't specify. The line between foreigner and native, once guarded by spears and oaths, began to soften. Not collapse, just soften, until it no longer mattered whether you had arrived to rule or to trade or to kneel. You were in Egypt, and Egypt didn't care what your reason was, only that you stayed long enough to forget it. Some soldiers did return to Rome, eventually, but they walked differently. They stopped at shrines no one had built. They used words no one else understood, and they kept quiet when the wine was passed around, not out of shyness, but out of reverence for a silence no longer spoken in the capital. One left behind a scroll, buried with him in Ostia. On it, he'd written, "I marched to conquer, but I stayed to be still." Egypt was not a place. It was the sound I made when I stopped pretending I knew where I was going. If you listen carefully, you'll hear that sentence carved in more than stone. You'll hear it in how Roman names began to fade from the census lists in certain towns. You'll hear it in the songs sung by children who knew both the eagle and the jackal and feared neither. You'll hear it in the rhythm of festivals that merged Saturnalia with river rituals, where no one could remember when one ended and the other began. It wasn't sedition, it was saturation. These soldiers didn't betray the empire, they translated it. Because sometimes, to survive in a place like Egypt, you don't resist it. You let it ride over you, not like an enemy, but like an older brother tracing your face to see if it remembers you from another life. And when that happens, the empire stops being something you serve. It becomes something you interpret, through touch, through food, through song, through silence. Even today, when scholars trace the cultural exchanges between Rome and Egypt, they often skip the soldiers too busy looking at governors and poets, high priests and revolts. But perhaps the truest story lives in the margins, in the barracks where a man removes his armor and cradles a sleeping child, unsure of what language to whisper dreams in. Because by then, it doesn't matter. The empire may have sent him here, but Egypt let him stay. They say Alexandria burned more than once, not just in one grand blaze, but in embers that kept catching long after the first flame died. Some fires are loud, theatrical, easily remembered because they make ruins out of triumph, but others are quieter, like whispers that smolder beneath floorboards. That was Alexandria. Not a single destruction, but a series of forgettings. And it wasn't just the library. You imagine walking its halls before the ash. Rows of papyrus, crisp and warm like dried leaves, waiting for autumn's breath. Scripts in Greek, Coptic, Aramaic, Sanskrit languages that only spoke to one another through the silence of someone willing to carry them. Some scrolls came wrapped in leather. Others wore nothing but the dust of 1,000 hands, each one a fragment of someone's reaching, each one convinced it mattered. But then came carelessness and conquest and the arrogance of utility. Rome didn't mean to burn knowledge, it meant to reorganize it. They wanted order, not origin. They wanted wisdom, but only if it aligned with Latin syntax. So scrolls deemed irrelevant were set aside, crammed into corners, forgotten until the candle tipped, or the wind pushed, or someone simply stopped looking. Of course, there were fires. One during Caesar's campaign, another under Aurelian, more still under Theophilus and the slow bleed of bureaucracy. Not all were acts of war. Some were accidents disguised as decisions. Some were decisions disguised as accidents. And the tragedy wasn't only in what burned, but in what no one noticed missing. Historians still debate how much was truly lost. Some argue the stories are exaggerated, romanticized by those who need the past to feel noble. Others believe that what vanished was irreplaceable texts on medicine, astronomy, ethics, poems written by voices erased so thoroughly that not even their echo remains. But the truth is harder to hold. The truth is that knowledge does not always disappear in fire. Sometimes it withers in neglect. Because even as ash drifted over marble, some scrolls survived, not in vaults, not in armories, but in kitchens, temples, and pockets. A midwife in Canopus kept one, folded into a cloth pouch, full of herbal recipes and moon cycle calculations. She never called it wisdom. She just called it what works. A priest near the island of Philae copied prayers from memory, then buried them in jars filled with salt and honey. His successor never found them. A child did 3 centuries later, and thinking them trash, used the papyrus to line a chicken coop. And still, something remained, because Alexandria was never just a place of knowledge. It was a place of longing. You didn't come here for answers. You came because you hoped someone else had already asked your question and left the words behind like footprints in wet sand. The Roman Empire loved scrolls, but distrusted ambiguity. It preferred facts cataloged, names recorded, sources footnoted even when those sources were copied from Greek originals they barely understood. But Egypt taught Rome to live with mystery. You see it in the margins, where translators leave notes like meaning unclear or possibly a metaphor or simply, here, we guess. Those guesses. They mattered. They were proof that not every sentence had to end in certainty. One scroll, badly damaged, tells of a Roman governor who consulted a local scribe during a drought. The scribe brought out a brittle document describing Nile patterns across 800 years. The Romans scoffed at its symbols, fish, stars, curved lines like wind. "This is not data," he said. The scribe said nothing. A week later, the flood came as the scroll predicted. The governor ordered the scribe's arrest, not because he was wrong, but because he was right in a language Rome couldn't control. You learn, slowly, that the empire's greatest weakness wasn't its borders. It was its insistence that knowledge must submit to hierarchy. Egypt didn't play that game. It hid truth in riddles, in rituals, in things you could only know by doing, not by reading. And so Rome copied what it could and quietly ignored the rest. But the rest didn't go away. It went underground, into the monasteries, into desert shrines, into memory. And memory, though fragile, burns differently. There's a story of a merchant in Oxyrhynchus who kept a ledger so meticulous it became a reference point for generations. Not because of profit, but because he recorded the dreams of his clients alongside their purchases. Bought figs, dreamed of a black cat, avoided travel. For him, commerce wasn't separate from spirit. He was laughed at, until 300 years later, when his entries helped predict a locust swarm. The Roman historians never cited him, but the people remembered. Even now, papyri unearthed from Egyptian rubbish heaps tell more about daily Roman life than the marble inscriptions in the Senate. Because while Rome engraved what it wanted remembered, Egypt composted what actually mattered. And what composts survives, quietly, organically, without applause. You sit beneath a crumbling arch in Alexandria's necropolis. Around you, broken tombs, bits of pottery, the last breath of incense that lingers longer than it should. You unfold a replica scroll translated into modern text. Of course, its original is too brittle to touch. The words describe star alignments used not for astrology, but for planting wheat. You realize this scroll, unread for centuries, was never meant for kings. It was meant for hands like yours, for dirt, for hunger, for seasons too long and too dry. And suddenly, you see it. Why so much of this wasn't preserved in vaults or palaces? Why it didn't need to be? Because the best parts of Alexandria's knowledge weren't locked away. They were lived, and living things don't burn the way books do. If something still flickers inside your breath, it's not from what was destroyed. It's from what refused to die. From what found other bodies to live, in women who whispered names into river water, men who remembered the angle of the sun, not from calculation, but from watching their fathers squint. Even Rome began to listen. Slowly, clumsily, but it did. Philosophers in the late imperial courts began quoting scrolls that didn't exist in the empire's archives. Where did they come from? No one answered, but the citations spread. And the ideas, strange and Eastern and disobedient, began to twist the marble columns of Latin logic into something softer, something that could bend without breaking. The burning of Alexandria wasn't an ending. It was a scattering. Not every fire is meant to erase. Some are meant to distribute. And as you breathe the dry air, thick with sun and dust and absence, you realize something strange. The scrolls that didn't survive as objects survived as habits, as practices, as instincts. Rome learned to ask better questions, not because it won wars, but because it lost control of the narrative. That's what Egypt did, not just to the soldiers, or the priests, or the economy, but to knowledge itself. It redefined permanence. It made information a matter of embodiment, not ownership. And if you've forgotten what that means, consider this: there are still people today who refuse to digitize certain texts, not out of defiance, but out of reverence. They believe some knowledge needs to live on skin and voice and time, not on screens. Because once you burn a scroll, it's gone. But if someone lives it, you can't unwrite that. If you could step inside, you might not even notice the altar first. You'd hear it before you saw it, the slow echo of footsteps across stone worn down, not by conquest, but by reverence. There's no grand proclamation in the air, no brass horn announcing a god's presence, only breath. Incense coils lazily above the floor, thick like memory, sweet like something half forgotten but never quite gone. In the temple, even silence feels like it's being listened to. The priests here don't bark orders, they whisper. Their rituals aren't designed to awe, but to harmonize. One adjusts a linen cloth with surgical care. Another sprinkles sand from a jar older than his father's bones. These aren't theatrical gestures. They are maintenance, not of faith, but of balance. The air hums not with miracle, but with the weight of precision. Because in Egypt, even worship was a kind of architecture, built not to impress gods, but to remind humans they were still part of the design. And Rome, mighty, sprawling, analytical Rome, didn't quite know what to do with that. It tried. It mapped the temples, studied the rites, cataloged the gods into neat equivalences. Isis, a version of Ceres. Horus, perhaps Mars, but with wings. Thoth was Hermes, if you squinted. But this filing system only worked on paper. Inside the temples, the categories bled. You didn't worship as a Roman or as an Egyptian, you just knelt. And that kneeling didn't feel borrowed, it felt ancestral. Rome, for all its might, had never quite mastered humility. But in these temples in Philae, in Edfu, in Memphis, it had no choice. It couldn't legislate belief. It couldn't legislate the way someone felt. Their spine curved during a chant they didn't understand, but suddenly felt necessary. And so, something shifted. Worship began to merge, not by decree, but by daily repetition. Roman officials consulted Egyptian oracles not to flatter locals, but because the omens felt more accurate. Local soldiers tied scarabs to their swords. Women lit lamps in patterns their mothers learned in Latin, but their grandmothers learned in silence. Over time, rituals ceased to be acts of political diplomacy. They became rhythms of daily survival, like bread rising or breath deepening in sleep. One governor's wife began attending moon festivals she wasn't invited to. At first, she was ridiculed, then imitated. 2 decades later, her daughter became a priestess, not of Jupiter or Juno, but of Hathor. She never saw it as conversion. She saw it as inheritance, There was no crisis, no rebellion, just absorption. And absorption doesn't ask permission, it simply continues. Even Augustus, careful to style himself as conqueror and savior, allowed the temples to remain not just structurally, but spiritually. He visited them, offered sacrifices, had himself portrayed in the regalia of a pharaoh. It wasn't just political theater, it was necessity. Egypt did not bend to Rome. It invited Rome in, but only on Egypt's terms. Historians still argue over how deep this syncretism ran. Some claim Rome merely tolerated local belief to avoid uprisings. Others suggest something more subtle happened, that the empire, so used to shaping the world, was being slowly reshaped in return. Not from above, but from within. You find an inscription not in Latin, not in Greek, but in Demotic Egyptian. It blesses a Roman governor by name, not for his conquests, but for his generosity in grain offerings. He is remembered not for what he ruled, but for what he gave away. That inversion says everything. The temples weren't just houses of gods. They were storehouses of grain, of prophecy, of medicine, of comfort. People came not only to worship, but to sleep, to be healed, to remember. The walls bore formulas for poultices and prayers alike. One woman came every week with a sick child. She never prayed aloud, she just left a piece of thread each time, red at first, then blue, then white. When the child grew stronger, the priest never took credit. They just offered her a place to sit. She stayed the night. She left at dawn. No one wrote her name down. But she wasn't forgotten, because no one left the temple empty-handed, not even Rome. By the 2nd century, Roman temples across the empire began adopting Egyptian iconography. Obelisks appeared in places they'd never belonged in city centers, in courtyards, in bathhouses, not because they were trophies, but because they had become familiar, even desirable. The exotic had become essential. In Rome itself, priests of Isis performed rites with astonishing regularity. Emperors whispered prayers in Egyptian under their breath, just in case the Latin ones weren't being heard anymore. And somewhere in the quiet center of an unnamed temple, a Roman soldier laid down a gift not for protection, but in gratitude. A bit of bread, a coin, a name scratched into stone, so faint it could have been erased by time, but wasn't. The temples never asked why. They only received. Even when Rome began to rot from within, these places held their rhythm. As emperors fell and borders trembled, the rituals remained. A priest in Thebes still lit his oil lamp the same way each dusk. A woman in Elephantine still ground herbs for dreams. Children still learned to walk by chasing cats through temple courtyards. And in this continuity, there was power not political, but emotional. Civilizations collapse, but patterns persist. Some say this persistence is what doomed Rome, that by absorbing so much, by allowing itself to be softened by the very people it conquered, it lost its shape. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the empire wasn't undone by empathy. Maybe it simply remembered what it meant to belong to something older than law, something not built on control, but on care. Even today, when archaeologists unearth votive offerings buried beneath collapsed columns, they often find them layered Roman coins wrapped in Egyptian linen, placed beside Greek inscriptions, 3 cultures in one hand, one hope expressed in 3 alphabets. That hope, that someone was listening, and maybe that someone was never the point. Because to bring a gift into a temple is to admit something sacred exists outside yourself, that you are not the axis, but the orbit. And that for a civilization like Rome, so obsessed with centrality, was the real conversion. Not to Egyptian gods, but to Egyptian perspective. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. They didn't wear the crown in the way Egypt remembered, but they wore it nonetheless. Not gold, not feathers, not the ceremonial beard that curled like a question, only the gods could answer. The new pharaohs came cloaked in red, armored in Roman law, and announced by governors instead of priests. But when they stepped off their ships, the earth still bowed, not out of loyalty, but memory. And that was enough, because Egypt didn't need its rulers to believe. It only needed them to repeat. So they did. For nearly 400 years, Roman emperors bore the title Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, not out of reverence, but obligation. The Nile required it. The temples required it. The harvest, the prayers, the steady pulse of something older than marble required it. And in time, the title ceased to be ceremonial. It became a kind of gravity. You could speak Latin. You could issue laws in Rome. But if you ruled here, you bent. Just slightly. Just enough. Imagine the moment it happened. A Roman emperor, let's say, Hadrian, walking into the temple at Dendera. He's been briefed by local scholars. He knows what to say. He repeats the lines. The priest nods, but something in Hadrian's voice falters. Not from fear, not from disbelief, but from recognition. The chant echoes longer than expected. A sound that isn't his own clings to his breath. It passes, but he never quite forgets it. Later, he builds temples in honor of Egyptian gods across the empire. Not replicas, integrations. The columns bear hybrid inscriptions. Latin syntax, cradling hieroglyphic metaphor. It's not syncretism. It's fusion born of fatigue. Rome is tired. Egypt is not. You wonder if he ever dreamed in two alphabets. Some emperors leaned in. Antoninus Pius was painted in the regalia of Osiris. Arms folded, eyes wide, lips parted just enough to whisper the name of a god he'd only known through translation. Septimius Severus reinstated privileges to the temples of Ptah not out of politics, but because he said, "The gods here answer faster." His son Caracalla, strange and splintered in mind, believed Egypt could restore what his father had lost. He made pilgrimages. He fasted. He listened to the stars in a language his tutors couldn't explain. This wasn't conversion. This was exhaustion finding ritual. And ritual, unlike reason, doesn't need to justify itself. It was during this century, maybe even this exact moment, that the Roman identity began to blur. Not in laws or in military ranks, but in symbols. The eagle began to share space with the falcon. Mars gave way to Horus. The laurel crown was offered in temples where the priests still spoke to stone. And if no one wrote down exactly when the shift became irreversible, it's because shifts like that don't arrive with trumpets. They arrive like tides. The Roman Empire had once defined itself by its ability to civilize the barbarian, to absorb and refine, to polish the crude. But Egypt wasn't crude. It was curated. Every temple, every statue, every myth was already a completed sentence. Rome couldn't edit that. It could only translate, and in translating, it began to echo instead of impose. Even the coins changed. Emperors minted in Alexandria began appearing with double inscriptions, Latin on one side, Greek or Egyptian on the other. Some depicted Roman deities with Egyptian attributes, Neptune holding the ankh, Minerva crowned with a sun disk. A few rare pieces replaced the imperial profile entirely with a symbol, a scarab, a lotus, a sunboat, not as decoration, as declaration. And who used these coins? Everyone. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers posted far from home, temple workers who didn't speak Latin, but knew enough to weigh silver by instinct. The currency flowed like the Nile, unbothered by borders, loyal only to gravity. You picture one such coin, warm from a market stall, pressed into a palm still dusted with flour. It buys not bread, but ink. And that ink writes a letter. And that letter describes a dream. And that dream, some flicker of vision half remembered at dawn, includes a man standing on a riverbank, speaking Latin, but wearing a crown shaped like the moon. There are no records of dreams, but sometimes they're the only things that survive. Reflective interlude. Maybe the past isn't made of years or rulers. Maybe it's made of languages trying to hold hands. And yet, for all this merging, something still resisted. Rome never truly owned Egypt. Not spiritually, not entirely, because ownership implies comprehension, and Egypt did not offer that. It offered depth, layers, riddles with no solutions, only better questions. The emperors may have claimed divine titles, but they were still outsiders. Their portraits hung in halls built before their grandparents' names were carved into the world. They issued edicts, and the edicts were obeyed, but only after they were filtered through 1,000 small customs, each one older than the ink it defied. This was Egypt's brilliance. It didn't rebel, it recontextualized. The temples kept functioning, even as governors changed. The Nile still flooded, unconcerned with who wore the laurel that year. Pilgrims still brought offerings to statues with broken faces, and priests, some Roman by blood, Egyptian by vocation, whispered prayers that no longer needed translation. Rome, for all its grandeur, was temporary. Egypt was a pattern. By the time the Christian emperors came, trying to erase what they could not understand, it was already too late. The old gods had stopped needing temples. They had become ideas. They lived in songs, in recipes, in the way a hand swept sand off a threshold before entering a home. You can outlaw a statue. You can't outlaw posture. A child born in Thebes during the late Roman era wouldn't know the difference. He'd hear hymns that rhymed with verses sung in Rome. He'd eat bread blessed in the shape of Ra's sun. He'd be baptized in a river that once held Pharaoh's boats. He'd speak Latin to his teacher, but dream in symbols no book had ever explained. Meta-thought transition. Maybe identity was never a flag. Maybe it was just the echo of footsteps through too many rooms, too many languages, all trying to remember the same silence. Some stories sound like victory. This one didn't. It sounded like breathing in a room you hadn't left, but had stopped recognizing. Rome didn't lose Egypt with a battle, and it didn't keep it with one either. What happened between them was slower than surrender, softer than allegiance, and quieter than conquest. It was absorption, the kind that doesn't require permission, because it doesn't knock. You don't remember the exact moment you started pronouncing a foreign word as if it were your own. You just realize you can't unhear it now. That was Rome, and that was Egypt. It began in rituals, small ones. Roman administrators began observing Nile-based festivals, not because they were commanded to, but because the people they governed expected them to. It was easier than enforcement, smoother than resistance. They adopted gestures the way an offering was held. The posture of a bow, the careful circumambulation of a shrine's outer wall, not as performance, but as practice. The motions became muscle memory, and from muscle memory came meaning. Rome didn't intend to convert, it intended to govern. But over time, administration required fluency, and fluency demands empathy, the subtle kind, not the grand gesture, but the 1,000 micro-adjustments one makes to be understood without force, the kind that turns mimicry into merging. Scholars still debate when that conversion crossed from habit to belief. Maybe it was when local officials stopped referring to Serapis as their god and simply said ours, or when temple tax revenues, once strictly Roman property, were partially redistributed to support famine relief not from policy, but suggestion. Somewhere, sometime, someone changed a line in an accounting ledger, just a word, but it meant something shifted. Control had become participation. And still, Rome thought itself in charge. The illusion of dominance lingered in its architecture. It built amphitheaters beside ancient temples, aqueducts near shrines, statues beside obelisks. But stone placement didn't matter. What mattered was attention, and slowly, attention wandered. The gods Rome raised began to feel younger than the ones Egypt never buried. Even the calendar yielded. The Egyptian civil calendar, long admired for its agricultural precision, began informing Roman planning in Egypt. Military deployments considered the flooding of the Nile. Grain exports adjusted to the rhythms of a river that obeyed no emperor. In time, those rhythms trickled into Rome's bureaucratic veins. What began as practical adaptation grew into a kind of reverence. Not religious, not yet, but rhythmic. The empire began to pulse differently, not in triumph, but in tempo. A visiting Roman governor wrote in his diary, "I came to bring order, and found myself waiting for signs." He was referencing agricultural omens, bird flight, river clarity, the behavior of cats near temples, but something in his phrasing suggested more than duty. It hinted at faith, not a loud, proclamatory kind, a quiet sort of leaning in, the type that grows like moss on a statue, not obvious at first, but irreversible once seen. Some of the most rigid Roman laws began to bend in Egypt. Legal code required trial by forum. Egypt returned decisions through oracles. Rome preferred verdicts. Egypt listened to outcomes. Rome counted evidence. Egypt weighed balance. These differences were once points of friction. But over time, adaptation proved easier than enforcement. In Alexandria, Roman judges began consulting Egyptian temple scrolls to settle land disputes. One senator claimed it was to better understand the logic of the locals, but another admitted, anonymously, that the verdicts simply felt truer. Truth doesn't always announce itself with certainty. Sometimes it's just the path with fewer obstacles. Sometimes it's the whisper that makes the noise unbearable. Meta-thought transition. Conversion doesn't always mean a change of heart. Sometimes it's just the slow erosion of resistance by something too old, too patient, and too kind to stop. It wasn't just law and ritual. It was language. Latin remained the empire's spine, but Egypt became its breath. Phrases slipped into Roman speech without translation. An officer referring to a subordinate as Capri, beloved spirit. A senator quoting an Egyptian proverb about reeds and silence. A child humming a melody her nursemaid claimed was a prayer, but never explained. No one called it learning. It just happened. Even names began to change. Children born in Egypt to Roman fathers and local mothers bore names that defied both traditions. Serapiona, Lukathoth, Marcus Ankh. They were linguistic bridges, syllabic compromise, and declarations of blended identity made not by politics, but by parenting. These weren't isolated instances. They became common enough to fade from comment. By the 3rd century, to be Roman in Egypt was not to be foreign, but to be folded in. A Roman citizen might wear a linen tunic dyed in local saffron, observe Egyptian mourning rituals, light oil lamps on feast days, and still consider themselves a servant of the emperor because identity no longer depended on separation. It depended on cohesion. Rome hadn't conquered Egypt. It had collided with it, and Egypt had absorbed the impact, softened it, and reshaped the pieces into something it could use. That was the conversion. From empire to ecosystem, from monument to murmuration, from power to pattern, no ceremony marked the moment. There were no banners, no new coins, just silence, the kind that comes after a breath you didn't realize you were holding. In that silence, something Roman, something hard and imperial dissolved, and something else older, rooted, river-worn took its place. Even when the ink dried, the memory didn't. Centuries passed, and yet every map Roman, Byzantine, medieval, or otherwise still outlined Egypt in a bolder stroke. It was never just cartography. It was remembrance with borders. You could redraw provinces, rename outposts, reassign governorships. But Egypt had become more than territory. It had become a shape in the mind, one that refused erasure. That refusal wasn't stubborn, it was sacred. Long after Rome fell into itself, not broken by a single siege, but hollowed by time and misjudgment, the image of Egypt held. Even when the empire split, fractured, turned on its own tongue and crown, Mapmakers hesitated at the Nile. They drew the familiar curve not out of habit, but out of reverence. This was the bend that had fed the empire's hunger, the delta that softened its grain into gold, the passage where Roman soldiers once traded not just goods, but selves. They couldn't forget, so they didn't. Some maps included notes, Egyptus once imperial, now eternal. Others were less poetic, more technical scribbled measurements, mile markers, tax zones. But the space still shimmered with its own weight. Egypt never returned to anonymity. It stayed luminous like a scar, or a secret. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. It wasn't just the boundaries, it was the symbols. Maps from later centuries, drawn by hands that had never seen Alexandria, still placed obelisks and temples with precision. Roman geographers, men trained in conquest and calculation, left room for myths. The pyramids were labeled with questions. Temples of Isis and Serapis bore annotations like still active or site of vision. Cartography became commentary, and commentary became confession. Rome hadn't fully digested what it had taken. It had only mapped the surface, because below every straight line was a curve that belonged to Egypt. The difference was never visible until nightfall, when the cities breathed differently, when the streets curved not toward forums, but toward shrines still hidden in shadows. Somewhere, a Roman archivist copied a papyrus that wasn't on the list. It had nothing to do with taxes or law. It was a hymn, handwritten, undeciphered, half-torn. But the scribe copied it anyway, word for word, line for mystery. That scroll made it into the imperial archive, not because it was required, but because someone couldn't leave it behind. Legacy has rules, but memory has a rhythm, and Egypt kept the beat. As centuries passed, empires looked back on Rome. Rome looked back on Egypt. The chain of gaze became so long it looped, and always, somewhere in the loop, someone asked why Egypt. It wasn't wealth. Others had gold. It wasn't location. Others held the crossroads. It wasn't even religion. Rome had absorbed hundreds of gods before. Egypt was different because it changed Rome without asking for permission. And change, when it happens like that, doesn't disappear. It embeds. A Roman general once described Egypt as a mirror that only reflects what you didn't want to see. It's hard to know what he meant. Maybe he saw himself praying at a shrine he'd mocked days before. Maybe he tasted bread baked with a prayer he didn't recognize, but couldn't forget. Maybe it was the silence, not absence, but intention that lingered after Egyptian rituals. A silence that made Roman clarity feel like noise. Meta-thought transition. What if maps didn't show territory, but the places we never stopped circling emotionally? Later, when the Byzantine Empire inherited Egypt, they too mapped it differently, not as conquest, but as inheritance. Their scrolls didn't label it ours, just known. A small distinction, but a deep one. It wasn't possession. It was familiarity, as if Egypt were a relative whose name couldn't be changed, even in exile. This familiarity bled into scholarship. Even centuries after the empire receded, Roman historians continued referencing Egypt not just as a region, but as a framework. Laws written for other provinces borrowed Egyptian terminology. Debates in philosophy used Nile metaphors, flow, balance, the fertility of thought. A Roman poet wrote, "Truth rises like the Nile dark, necessary, and not on your schedule." This wasn't flattery, it was fluency. You wonder if anyone noticed the pivot, if some scholar paused, halfway through a text on Roman law, and realized how many Egyptian words had crept into his Latin, how many concepts now lacked translation, but were still used, how silence had become syntax. And what of the people? Egyptians born under Rome, whose grandparents knew pharaohs, whose children would see monks lived between maps. Their daily lives weren't drawn, they were walked. A street that once ended at a Roman bath might now curve into a shrine, or a school, or a graveyard. The transitions weren't marked. They were felt. Felt in the way water tastes different in different vessels. Felt in the dust that settled unevenly on inscriptions, some names Roman, some Egyptian, all softened by time. There's a kind of loyalty that isn't declared. It's just assumed. Maps captured none of this, but they hinted. A faint curl at the Nile's edge, an extra symbol beside a temple ruin, a note in the margin. Wind stronger here. Bring offerings. Maps didn't forget because cartographers couldn't. Not when Egypt had become the measure. Not of size, but of depth. The place where every empire, even Rome, realized it was temporary. You don't remember the beginning. Not clearly. Just a whisper of stone on sandal. A breath pressed between reed scrolls. A shadow cast across two names, one Roman, one Egyptian, both written in a language that no longer asks permission. This is how legacy lives, not in monuments or victories, but in patterns too soft to trace, until you look back and realize you've walked in them the whole time. By the 4th century, Egypt was no longer a question in the Roman imagination. It was the answer that had seeped into every parchment, prayer, and price. It shaped the way Rome thought about memory, and how it remembered thinking at all. You couldn't draft a legal code without invoking Egyptian models of inheritance. You couldn't build a cathedral without echoes of Isis in the ribs of the dome. You couldn't write about the afterlife without using a metaphor that the Nile birthed and Rome borrowed. The legacy was not loud. It was never meant to be. It sat in the air like old dust unnoticed until light passed through it. It was something you inhaled without meaning to, something that settled behind your eyes, so that even when you blinked, it was still there. And what was it? Not conquest, not tribute, not obedience. Something quieter. The quiet was architectural. You could see it in the way Roman domes leaned toward lotus-shaped curves, how arches began to mimic the mouths of temple doorways. Alexandria's scholars had whispered blueprints into the empire's ear for centuries. But the empire no longer distinguished the origin. Ideas belonged to use now. And Egypt, always generous in silence, let Rome believe they were its own. If the quiet held you longer than you meant, just say so. Even now. The quiet had another shape, too, language. By this point, Latin was no longer a pure tongue. It carried inflections from Greek, Nabatean, Aramaic, but Egypt left something else inside it. A rhythm, a pacing of breath, sentences that wandered, doubled back, paused like someone listening to the river before continuing. This wasn't translation. This was absorption. The Roman tongue had learned to move like a boat in shallow current, cautious, reverent, unhurried. The breath of Egypt didn't just alter what Rome said. It softened why it said anything at all. You saw it most clearly in death. Roman funerary traditions, once solemn, formulaic, clean, began to adopt the complexities of Egyptian farewell. Mummification didn't become universal, but the idea that the soul required preparation, ritual, and narration returned. Tombs bore painted scenes again, not just names. Stories were entombed beside bodies. Inscriptions didn't boast. They asked, did I love rightly? Was I gentle when I could have been cruel? Questions carved in Latin, framed in Egyptian imagery, buried beneath Roman banners that now drooped like wilting prayers. Because sometimes empire isn't defeated. It just begins to dream in another tongue. Sleep anchor. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. It wasn't just the tombs, it was the gestures. Roman mourners began adopting the silence of Egyptian grief. Hands pressed to lips, ash in the hair, days of retreat. Mourning as motionlessness. You'd find scrolls written during this time with entire pages left blank, not from oversight, but respect. The space was the statement. The silence said enough. This was the legacy. Egypt taught best presence without proclamation. Even children's toys changed. You'd find dolls carved in wood, painted with both Roman togas and Egyptian wigs, amulets shaped like scarabs, worn beside bronze medallions of emperors. A child's bedtime prayer might name Augustus and Osiris in the same breath, not as a heresy, but a comfort. That duality wasn't confusing. It was complete. And still, Rome called Egypt a province. As if provinces could teach empires how to breathe. As if the dust on their own roads hadn't come from Nile mud, carried in the seams of sandals, worn thin by soldiers who stopped coming home. There were scholars, even skeptics, who noticed this. One philosopher in Gaul wrote bitterly that Rome no longer worships, it reminisces. He meant it as critique, but perhaps it was truth. Rome had begun to look backward with longing, not at its victories, but at what it had survived. And Egypt, somehow, was always in that picture, not beside the throne, but beneath it. The floor on which the emperor stood, the breath he borrowed when the crown grew too heavy. Meta-historical interlude. Maybe this wasn't forgetting. Maybe it was the only way to carry it without breaking. Because how do you remember a thing that changed your shape? How do you thank something that didn't ask to be thanked, only followed? Egypt didn't vanish when Rome dissolved. It didn't gloat or collapse. It simply stayed. It watched Byzantium rise and fall. It endured Islam's arrival with the patience of a river that knows floods come and go. The temples closed. The languages faded. But the posture of the land never bowed. The breath remained. Maps still marked the region, but fewer labeled it Rome. And still, the lines persisted, not as possession, but presence. So what legacy did Rome leave? Coins, ruins, roads? No. The real legacy was the silence left behind, the hush between rituals, the weightless change in how power felt when it ceased shouting and began listening. And what legacy did Egypt give? A rhythm, a patience, a breath, a map that wouldn't forget. You wonder when Rome stopped speaking to itself in Latin and started listening in another voice. It didn't happen all at once. Empires don't shatter like glass. They dissolve like wax near the candle's end, softening quietly. Shape intact, but never the same again. By the 4th century, Rome was no longer the Rome it had promised itself to be. It ruled. Yes, it still minted coins and raised banners, but something had shifted in the marrow. Its gods were tired. Its victories came with no applause. And when it reached for certainty, it found Egypt instead. Egypt had never asked for the empire, but it had let it in, the way a wall lets ivy creep over stone, not to be devoured, not to be hidden, just softened. And so Rome, unknowingly, began to pray in borrowed rhythms. In temples now half Christian, half forgotten, children were baptized with Latin names beside altars still echoing with the scent of myrrh older than scripture. A bishop raised his hand in blessing, and behind him, carved into the worn column, was the still unfaded eye of Horus. No one commented, because no one needed to. The overlap was no longer strange. It was expected. You walk through those temples, still, in dreams, perhaps, or in the folds of a book left open too long. There's dust on the pages, but not from neglect, from memory. And under that dust, hieroglyphs no Roman ever learned to speak, but somehow always seemed to understand. Rome never fell in Egypt. It faded. And Egypt, steady, unfazed, eternal, did what it had always done. It received, it absorbed, it outlived. There is a softness to legacy when no one tries to claim it. A gentleness in the way Egypt let Rome wrap itself in its myths and call them Roman. Isis wore a Roman gown. Caesar was painted with coal. The empire dreamed, and the dream had two voices. Not in opposition, in echo. A coin found buried near Luxor bore a Latin inscription and an Egyptian glyph pressed over it. Not stamped, pressed. As if someone wanted the metal to remember, but not loudly. That coin is now lost to scholars, but not to the wind. Somewhere, someone still dreams of a Rome that walked barefoot on sand and didn't call it foreign. Meta-thought interlude. Some things aren't forgotten because they were important. They're remembered because forgetting them would mean losing something of ourselves. And when the Western Empire finally crumbled, not with fanfare, but with a shrug, it wasn't Egypt that mourned. It had seen kings rise like the tide and vanish with less noise than a cracked papyrus. Rome was just another name. Egypt had never depended on names, only on breath, on ritual, on silence that asked nothing but to be kept. That silence had always been Rome's final lesson. If the empire had listened more closely to the priests, still humming in doorless shrines, to the markets where spices bore names no senator could pronounce, maybe it would have known that survival isn't dominance, it's rhythm. Rome came to conquer, but it stayed to learn. And what it learned, it couldn't ever fully explain, only carry. That's the mark of transformation. So when Byzantium inherited what was left, when the eagle had only one head and even fewer feathers, it kept Egypt in the ledgers. But Egypt wasn't numbers. It was memory. And memory isn't always loyal to fact. It curls around what lingers. And what lingered most was the language between languages. A scholar wrote of this in the 5th century. The people speak in two winds, one for the emperor, one for the dead. He didn't mean it metaphorically, but maybe he should have. Because Rome, in the end, didn't forget Egypt. It became it. It kept its marble and its laws, its forums and festivals. But in the quiet in the twilight before a speech, or the moment a mosaic was unveiled, you'd catch it. A flicker, a hush, a second thought, as if the empire was asking itself, who are we now? And the answer, every time, was older than its own tongue. Egypt didn't reply. It didn't need to. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. You've walked through stone tonight, and shadow, through rivers that remember your name and temples that never needed to speak it, through silence that built empires and empires that only learned to listen once they stopped conquering. So now, the story ends, but not with thunder, not with collapse, just with breath. And now, the final wind down begins. The quiet around you isn't empty. It's layered with the weight of hours that didn't ask to pass, and the soft remains of thoughts that came and left without forming into full sentences. Maybe you're lying there, still, not quite asleep, not quite thinking, somewhere between drift and return. The air in the room is holding itself steady, not in stillness, but in softness. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand. It just waits, like Egypt did, like history does, when it realizes it's not being read, but listened to. You're not required to remember any of this. You don't have to trace the names or sort the metaphors. This story was never meant to teach, only to stay, like dust on a candle you never lit, like the breath before a question that didn't need to be asked. Your body might be heavier now, not in burden, but in release. Your mind, softer stretched thin like linen in fading light. You've wandered. That's enough. Let your thoughts dissolve, like Rome did not in failure, but in quiet. Let your breath forget which tongue it's dreaming in, Latin or hieroglyph, memory or sleep, it doesn't matter now. The night has taken it gently. If something about this whisper of a world stayed behind, you can leave it below, just a mark, a nod, a soft reply. I read them, especially the ones that barely breathe. This was Boring History Nights. You've come far enough for one night. Let the quiet carry you now. And if sleep hasn't come yet, maybe this softened the weight. This was Boring History Nights. Until next time, sleep softly.